Matt, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
It's great to be with you always, and I'm honored to be together with the Cipher Brief. It's a great
Thank you.
publication.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. The topic of today's interview is 2008 war, August War, as it's called, when Russia invaded Georgia. The war lasted for 5 days, but many experts think that it had implications that we're still seeing today. What do you think the biggest impact of that war is as we're looking at things today?
I think the biggest impact of Russia's invasion of Georgia, that doesn't pertain just to Georgia, is Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and its earlier invasion of Crimea and Donbass. I recall then President Mikhail Saakashvili saying it in the most succinct way possible. Crimea's next. He said that in April of 2008. And similarly, then French President Nicolas Sarkozy published an op-ed in the Washington Post, I think it was like the 18th of August, in which he, to paraphrase, said it's really terrible that Russia invaded Georgia. And if they do the same thing to Ukraine, then that would be really bad and we would have to react. So it was as if Sarkozy himself was admitting that Russia already had Ukraine in its sights because of what it did to Georgia, and yet we still didn't do anything.
And Putin, it was not a secret because Putin declared in 2007 that was his plan, that he had a greater vision for Russia than we perceived. So, are you saying that the invasion or little green men that Russia sent into Crimea was a continuation of 2008?
Yeah, which was a continuation of April 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest. Yeah, the NATO summit outcome was the worst possible phrasing in terms of Putin's mindset and knowing he comes from the position that, as you said, he articulated at the Munich Security Conference. The outcome was that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO someday, but not yet. So act now. And that was 4 months later, he did act and invaded Georgia.
Where do you see the full scale invasion of Ukraine as we keep in mind the 2008 war that Russia started in Georgia? Is this a part of the same process, part of the same
Yeah,
thinking?
I think it's part of the same mentality of Putin, which is to push until stopped. Fight as far as you can go until you can go no further, until there's a real cost to be paid. When I was still working in the U.S. government, I always looked at one of my main duties from the perspective of some of our NATO allies, France, Germany, and the UK, as being the Saakashvili manager, meaning that they assumed that then President Saakashvili was unstable, irrational, and wanted war with Russia, and they would say, well, you know him. You guys have some sort of a friendship. You're the U.S. You got to manage him, and they. That recalls in me, the calculus of Putin. I made that. I made the point that to my European colleagues, and then to the Russian deputy chief of the general staff, that you're always asking us to rein in President Saakashvili. He's not crazy. He knows Russia's military is unbeatable, but he's being maneuvered into a corner. And I remember saying, I don't know how much longer we can dissuade him from reacting to so many Russian provocations. So my French and German and British counterparts, they didn't like that. And they just, I don't know, maybe they assumed that I just wasn't trying hard enough. The Russian deputy chief of the general staff said, just 1 minute, I have to make a call, after I said that to him in his office, just down the street from the Kremlin. And then he came back, and we continued the conversation. But from that moment on, the Russian Foreign Ministry and Deputy Foreign Minister Grigory Karasin and the Russian military became unavailable. This was like in June of 2008. They could not meet. They said everybody's on vacation, and that was because they realized that they were going to be able to provoke Georgia and provoke President Saakashvili to respond when they started shooting in South Ossetia, I
Now,
think.
in Georgia, there is still a disagreement about when the war actually started, on the 7th or the 8th. How do you explain that?
That depends on who you want to blame. And it's also, a result of the so-called fog of war. I believe and was saying at the time that the conflict began way before 2008. I mean, you could pick your moment in time. Was it when the Russians shot down that Georgian drone? Was it when in June they launched the missile attack at the on the radar station at Tbilisi airport? Was it when the Russians started issuing passports, Russian passports to South Ossetians and Abkhaz, residents of South Ossetia and Abkhazia? I mean, was it when there were some assassinations that happened on the separatist territories? Now, looking backward, we see that it was hybrid war. Russia had begun the conflict, had begun the war way before I think anyone in the West recognized it was happening, and even after Russia's invasion of Georgia, there were still plenty of people in European capitals and in Washington who wanted to blame Georgia for somehow starting it, and as if Georgia again was its leadership was so insane that it thought, here's a good idea. Let's go to war with the world's second largest military. They didn't want that war. Anyway, that's how I saw it. Another aspect of the fog of war, though, was that the Russians, in my reading, were very clever in how they provoked the actual retaliation by the Georgians. So I got a phone call in Washington. I forgot what time, probably around 11 p.m. From then Foreign Minister Eka Tikashvili. And she said, we want to convey to you guys that the Russians are shooting over the heads of, or the South Ossetians, sorry, are shooting over the heads of Russian troops. And we're holding our fire. We know you've told us don't fire back. And we are restraining ourselves. But then she called like 3 more times and said, but it's getting worse and worse, larger caliber ammunition. Until finally she said, we know you don't want us to retaliate, but we have to. We have to defend our people. We have to defend ourselves. So we're going to retaliate. And the Russians knew that to retaliate, to shoot at the South Ossetians meant shooting toward and at the Russians. And so then the Russians could say the Georgians attacked us. But it was the Russians who provoked it. So that what I just explained to you is complicated, even just to listen to. And therefore, and very few people knew that bit of the story. So it's easy to be confused about when the war started and who started it. But it really doesn't matter because the Russians provoked it. They had been planning for it. Even, I remember in June 2004, God rest his lovely soul, then Prime Minister Zurab Zhvania called me and said, we need help. The Russians are moving armored equipment, tanks and other armored vehicles through the Roki Tunnel, and then they're hiding them in the forest near the village of Java in South Ossetia. So please help us expose this, and let's figure out how Georgia can protect itself. So the Russians planned their invasion for at least 4 years, and also planned the deception to make it look like Georgia caused the war.
From the US side, you were a part of this whole process. You know all the details of this.
Yeah.
So, do you think the provocation was avoidable from the Georgian side?
I do, but maybe not in the way your question foresees. I don't think there was anything that the Georgian government could have done to avoid this provocation once things got into Russia's phase of, executing the final stage of its plan. I mean, look what Ukraine did, right? Ukraine didn't do anything in 2014 when the Little Green Men, as you mentioned, invaded Donetsk and Crimea, and still Crimea became so Anschluss, right? I mean, Russia annexed it. The Ukrainians couldn't have followed our dictates to do nothing any more than they did. So Putin was going to bring Georgia to war one way or the other. The only way it could have been stopped was if we all woke up in Washington, Brussels, Paris, Berlin, London, reread Putin's speech from the 2007 Munich Security Conference, realized he meant it. One thing Putin does is he telegraphs what his moves are going to be when they're dramatic foreign policy moves. I mean, it's an uncomfortable thing for me to say, but he's honest in these cases. So we were all asleep, and had we been awake, we could have deterred the Russians. But there's nothing the Georgian government could have done, in my mind.
Do you think we woke up after 2008 and after 2014.
No, we didn't for sure. And by the way, the Georgians, I mean, the Georgians did behave in, provocative way toward the Russians as well. I mean, it's not like the Georgians were, as I said, just sitting there like the Ukrainians and doing nothing. President Saakashvili was also quite provocative, but he didn't start the war. We definitely did not wake up after 2014. In fact, I remember I was talking to a BBC presenter at Brussels Forum in like March, well, whenever the Brussels Forum, it's like in March, of 2014. And I told him, I was listening to your broadcast when the Ukrainians were being invaded by the Russians. And what you said on the air was that this must be some kind of a mistake. There's no way the Russians would have moved into Ukrainian territory. And I asked him point blank, why would you assume that? And he said, well, none of us expected this. Like, what do you mean? Again, Munich Security Conference. So, and after 2014, we still had this ridiculous Minsk process going. So no, we were sound asleep until February 24th, 2022.
What do you make of the regional implications of the 2008 war? Anything will change moving forward? So, basically, the question is, what is the impact of the 2008 August war on the regional geopolitics and maybe even global geopolitics?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I mean, I touched on it briefly. I mean, one of the implications was, of course, Putin feeling he had a green light for a virtually cost-free invasion of Ukraine and annexation of lots of its territory, and fully pulling Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. And so the consequences of that are still to be seen. But I'm arguing there's a direct link in Putin's mind from our failure to respond to his decision to invade and annex Ukraine, and in his mind, maybe go beyond that if he were to succeed. Consequence for him, though, of all of that is, he has stimulated the enlargement of NATO. He has put himself in, I think, a very vulnerable position. As a human being and as a leader, he has completely humiliated Russia around the world. He's caused the loss of so many hundreds of thousands of, yes, Ukrainians, but way more Russians. And that whole geopolitical evolution is an utter disaster for Russia. But we still don't know what disaster is going to pay for the rest of us. So there's that whole stimulation of Europe's largest war since World War II, with enormous implications, and globally, with China, Russia having a limit-free partnership, huge implications. And if Russia's war on Ukraine is a continuation of Georgia, then we have the whole question of the lessons that China learns vis-a-vis Taiwan. Huge set of issues. But then there's the domestic political issues in Georgia as well. I think without the Russian invasion of Georgia and then the battle over who's to blame, I think it would have been much more difficult for Georgian Dream to win the 2012 election. I don't know that the national movement would have stayed in power, and there were plenty of sins committed by the national movement government. But the pathway was made much smoother, let's put it that way, for Bidzina Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream when Georgia had suffered such a political military debacle.
If you liked this week's show, remember there's more where this came from. You can find extended interviews with the experts on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel as well as other social media platforms. And we invite you to visit our website at decipherbrief.com for your daily dose of national and global security news. I'm Iya Meormishvili. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next week.